What if I told you that one of the most scandalized members of the British royal family had finally decided to break his silence, and that what he revealed would leave one of the most talked-about figures in the world utterly speechless? The question alone is enough to make anyone pause. For years, Prince Andrew has existed in a shadow of disgrace, stripped of his titles, privileges, and the royal aura that once seemed untouchable. He has been the subject of whispers, headlines, and courtrooms. He has been mocked, vilified, and written off by many as a man whose time in the spotlight should have ended long ago. Yet here he is, emerging from that long silence with claims so shocking, so sensational, that they demand our attention. And the person at the center of these claims? Meghan Markle. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For decades, the royals have maintained an image of untouchable composure. Scandal, betrayal, and intrigue are usually filtered, contained, and carefully managed behind palace walls. But there are moments when the truth slips through, moments when a story so raw and so personal breaks the carefully constructed facade. This is one of those moments. Prince Andrew, once a prince celebrated for his charm and military service, has endured public shaming, social isolation, and legal battles. But isolation has a way of sharpening truths, of prompting confessions, and of pushing people to finally speak when the world expects nothing from them. Now, Andrew is speaking, and what he has to say will not only shock the public, but also reverberate through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. His revelations are intimate, startling, and deeply personal. They involve Meghan Markle, a woman who has herself been both celebrated and criticized on an unprecedented global scale. And according to Andrew, the nature of their interactions, the private dynamics, and the secrets they share are unlike anything the public has ever imagined. So why does this matter now? Because timing is everything. The royal family has been navigating multiple crises in recent months, from public feuds between the Sussexes and the establishment to ongoing debates about the role of royals in modern Britain. Andrew's disclosures arrive at a moment when the public is already questioning loyalties, honesty, and the true nature of power within the monarchy. These are not merely gossip headlines. They are revelations that challenge long-held perceptions and force us to rethink the very relationships that shape the British royal narrative. But before we dive into the explosive claims, it's important to understand the man at the center of this storm. Prince Andrew is no stranger to controversy. For years, he lived a life that seemed glamorous, untouchable, and enviable. Privilege, connections, and influence surrounded him. But every ascent has its descent, and Andrew's fall from grace has been both public and humiliating. Titles revoked, roles stripped, privileges removed, invitations rescinded. He became a cautionary tale, a man whose very name now evokes scandal, questions, and moral judgment. And yet, in the quiet of his personal life, Andrew has been watching, waiting, and considering the right moment to speak. What could possibly prompt him to finally break the silence? The answer is complex, layered, and deeply human. Isolation breeds reflection, and reflection often breeds revelation. Andrew's life, once governed by protocol, appearances, and unyielding public scrutiny, has been reduced to private contemplation, private regrets, and private encounters that the world has never seen. It is in this private sphere that he claims his interactions with Meghan Markle took place, a place far from the public eye, far from cameras, far from judgment. And in breaking his silence, Andrew is not merely recounting events. He is attempting to reclaim a narrative, to assert control over a story that has largely been told without him. Imagine, for a moment, what it would be like to be stripped of every symbol of status you had once held. Your titles revoked, your privileges removed, your reputation dissected and debated in public. Most would retreat further into anonymity, to hide from the world that had once adored them. But Andrew's decision to speak is not just an act of defiance. It is a bold statement, a declaration that some truths, no matter how uncomfortable, cannot remain buried forever. And what makes this even more compelling is the subject of these truths. Meghan Markle, a woman who has mastered the art of public image, influence, and narrative control. According to Andrew, the story he has to tell about her is not one that has been shared before, and it contradicts much of what the public has been led to believe. As we prepare to explore this story, consider this: the royals are human. They experience betrayal, desire, jealousy, and secrecy just like anyone else. But when these human moments occur under the relentless gaze of the world, the stakes are magnified, the emotions are amplified, and the consequences are dramatic. Andrew's revelation is a window into such a moment, an intimate, private experience that has the potential to rewrite public understanding of key figures. The details are explosive, the context is critical, and the fallout is guaranteed to be widespread. There are questions that demand answers. What was the nature of Andrew's interactions with Meghan? How private were these encounters? And perhaps most importantly, how will this revelation reshape the already complicated public perception of Meghan Markle? Andrew's decision to speak now is not accidental. It is calculated, deliberate, and aimed at a moment when the story will resonate with the largest possible audience. And as the public digests these claims, the palace braces itself for both scrutiny and scandal. It is impossible to overstate the tension surrounding this story. On one hand, we have Andrew, a disgraced prince seeking to assert his narrative. On the other, Meghan Markle, a woman whose public persona is fiercely curated, now confronted with claims that touch upon her most private interactions. Between them lies a chasm of secrecy, speculation, and the heavy weight of public opinion. And as the story unfolds, it will challenge not just our understanding of individual behavior, but our assumptions about privilege, discretion, and the personal vulnerabilities hidden beneath the polished surface of royalty. And yet, this story is not merely about scandal. It is about power, its use, its misuse, and its consequences. It is about the collision of private lives with public scrutiny. It is about how secrets, when revealed, have the capacity to upend reputations and relationships. And it is about the tension between truth and perception in a world obsessed with status, image, and control. For Prince Andrew, breaking his silence is an act that carries risk, reward, and, above all, the promise of revelation. For Meghan Markle, it is a moment that demands attention, reflection, and perhaps a recalibration of her own narrative. So why should you care? Because this story is emblematic of the high stakes of royal life in the modern era. It is a story of secrecy, power, intimacy, and scandal, all unfolding under the relentless scrutiny of the world's eyes. Every whisper, every revelation, every public reaction becomes amplified, dissected, and debated. And for those of us watching, it is both enthralling and deeply human, a reminder that even those born into privilege are not immune to drama, desire, and the consequences of their choices. And here's the cliffhanger. What Andrew reveals about Meghan Markle is not just scandalous. It challenges everything the public thinks it knows about her. It is intimate, it is shocking, and it is utterly unanticipated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it feel like to fall from the heights of royal privilege to a life shadowed by scandal and public contempt? Imagine waking up one morning to headlines that not only question your reputation, but actively strip you of the very symbols that defined your identity. For Prince Andrew, this was no hypothetical. It was reality. A reality that began years ago, slowly building until the eventual collapse was undeniable. Andrew was born into a world of wealth, influence, and deference. Every room he entered, every handshake he extended, every smile he offered carried the weight of history, tradition, and expectation. But no amount of royal birthright can shield a person from scandal when the public eye turns, and the mechanisms of accountability, both legal and social, take their course. The trajectory of Andrew's fall is a cautionary tale about power, privilege, and perception. At first, the whispers were quiet, almost ignorable. Allegations, rumors, and subtle insinuations began circulating in the media, small cracks in what had always seemed like an unbreakable facade. Yet, as months turned into years, the whispers grew louder, harder to ignore, impossible to dismiss. Legal battles emerged, accusations gained traction, and the once untouchable prince found himself under scrutiny in a way he had never anticipated. It is important to understand that Andrew's public disgrace did not happen overnight. It was the product of a perfect storm of events, associations, choices, and moments of miscalculation that combined to form a narrative the monarchy could not ignore. He was summoned to account not only to the law but to public opinion, which can be, in its own way, even harsher. The stripping of titles, the removal of patronages, the loss of public standing. All of these measures were unprecedented in modern British royal history, signaling that no amount of lineage or privilege could shield a member from consequences. But while the public narrative painted Andrew as a disgraced figure, a man who had fallen from grace and deserved the scrutiny, the private reality was more complex. Behind closed doors, Andrew wrestled with humiliation, isolation, and a profound sense of loss. How does one navigate a world where the symbols of identity, titles, roles, privileges are suddenly revoked? How does a person come to terms with being viewed as a cautionary tale rather than a prince? The emotional toll was immense, and yet, it was in this crucible of isolation that Andrew's reflections, his anger, and his eventual resolve began to take shape. Imagine living in a gilded palace, where every corridor holds memories of ceremony, celebration, and command, and then suddenly realizing that those spaces are no longer yours to occupy with authority. The public may see only headlines and scandal, but behind the palace walls, there is a human being grappling with disorientation, shame, and the desire for redemption or, at the very least, explanation. This is the Andrew few ever saw, a man stripped of privilege, forced into solitude, reflecting on his past, and contemplating the future. Yet, even in disgrace, Andrew's life continued in private spheres where the world had little access. These were spaces of human behavior unfiltered by cameras or protocol. Here, the man who had once been a prince in every sense, publicly admired, socially celebrated, institutionally reinforced, existed as a human being, flawed, reflective, and, above all, aware of the power of narrative. In this space, Andrew began to consider speaking, sharing truths that the public would never have guessed, truths that could challenge assumptions, provoke shock, and command attention. It was not just scandal that defined Andrew's fall. There was a profound contradiction in how he was perceived versus how he experienced life. Publicly, he was judged, criticized, and ostracized. Privately, he navigated relationships, emotions, and desires just like anyone else. Yet the stakes were magnified by the royal context. A single revelation, a single interaction, could be amplified 1,000-fold by media scrutiny and public fascination. And it was precisely in this heightened environment that Andrew's eventual revelations about Meghan Markle would gain both potency and shock value. Consider the psychology of disgrace. For most people, disgrace leads to withdrawal, avoidance, and silence. For Andrew, disgrace became a crucible, forcing introspection and the eventual consideration of speaking out. What secrets had he held? What truths had been contained by the fear of public reaction? And how would revealing these truths shift the balance of perception between him, Meghan Markle, and the broader royal family? These are questions few dared to ask, but they would become central to the story that is now unfolding. Andrew's stripped titles were more than symbolic gestures. They were markers of lost identity, lost influence, and lost dignity. Each public statement about revocation, each removed privilege, reinforced the narrative of disgrace. And yet, within this story of loss lies the seed of Andrew's eventual disclosure. For the first time in years, he was free from certain obligations, from the constant expectations of public appearances, from the rigid protocols that had governed his every move. And in that space, he began to construct a narrative that would shock the world, beginning with the revelation that involved Meghan Markle, a woman whose own life had been subject to intense public fascination. Public perception, of course, plays a role in every royal scandal. Andrew's fall became a spectacle, a cautionary tale amplified by media narratives. Yet public perception is notoriously imperfect. It often fails to capture nuance, context, and the private dynamics that shape behavior. Andrew's story is not just about public disgrace. It is about the hidden realities of his life, the private decisions, and the intimate encounters that have never been revealed. These private elements, when unveiled, have the power to shock even the most seasoned royal observers. And here lies the dramatic pivot. While Andrew's public image had been largely defined by loss and disgrace, the private truths he holds remain largely untold. It is in this untold space that Meghan Markle enters the narrative. The world knows her as a public figure, a duchess, a celebrity, and a polarizing presence. But Andrew's account promises to reveal dimensions of their interactions that no one has seen or heard before. Intimate, private, and controversial, these revelations are not mere gossip. They are insights into the intersections of power, secrecy, and desire within one of the world's most scrutinized families. The tension is palpable. On one hand, we have Andrew, a disgraced prince who has spent years in isolation, weighing the consequences of speaking out. On the other, we have Meghan Markle, whose carefully curated public persona is now challenged by intimate revelations. Between them lies a story that promises to upend assumptions, provoke emotional reactions, and compel the public to reassess their judgments. How did these encounters unfold? What was said? And how did both parties navigate the private and public stakes of their interactions? As Andrew prepares to speak, it is worth reflecting on the magnitude of the risk. Royals rarely, if ever, disclose intimate details that could embarrass, provoke, or destabilize the family narrative. Andrew's decision to break his silence is therefore radical, audacious, and potentially transformative. His revelations about Meghan Markle are not casual anecdotes. They are assertions that, if taken at face value, demand reconsideration of public perceptions, royal propriety, and personal dynamics within the palace. And now comes the mini cliffhanger. Just as Andrew's private world collided with Meghan Markle's carefully managed public persona, the first revelation that he would share sent shockwaves through both their lives. What he revealed next would not just surprise the public, it would force the palace, the media, and the world to confront a story no one was expecting. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What happens when the public persona of a royal diverges completely from the private reality? When the world sees one image, polished and curated, while another life exists behind closed doors, hidden from cameras, guards, and public scrutiny. For Prince Andrew, this divergence became not just a personal coping mechanism, but a stage for the secrets that would eventually captivate the world. Andrew's life, like that of every royal, was governed by appearances, protocol, and expectation. Every handshake, every wave, every smile was scrutinized, catalogued, and analyzed. Yet behind the velvet curtains of Buckingham Palace, Royal Lodge, or even private retreats abroad, a different reality existed. A life of late-night conversations, clandestine meetings, whispered confidences, and decisions that the public would never see coming. It was in these private spaces that Andrew navigated his feelings, desires, and frustrations away from the judgmental eyes of a global audience. Imagine the palace at night. Empty halls, chandeliers dimmed, shadows stretching across walls lined with portraits of ancestors who once commanded armies, navigated wars, and shaped history. Andrew walks these corridors, reflecting on a life that has gone from privilege to scandal, from celebrated prince to pariah. Here, in these moments of solitude, Andrew's mind replays choices, actions, and encounters that the public has no access to. This is where the story of Meghan Markle begins. Not in tabloids, not in interviews, but in these private spaces where truth and desire converge. Andrew's private world was complex, layered with contradiction. On one hand, he was a man stripped of titles, haunted by public disgrace, and aware of the media scrutiny that could strike at any moment. On the other, he was still a man with human desires, relationships, and impulses, navigating connections that could never see the light of day. How do you reconcile being a public figure with intense private inclinations? How do you maintain composure in front of the world while wrestling with emotions and encounters that could destroy you if revealed? These were questions Andrew faced daily. And then there was Meghan Markle. She entered this private narrative not as a global celebrity, but as a woman whose path intersected with Andrew's in ways that were intimate, secret, and, by all accounts, unimaginable given the scrutiny surrounding both their lives. According to Andrew, their initial encounters were unremarkable, almost mundane in context, yet they carried undercurrents of tension, intrigue, and curiosity. What begins as polite conversation evolves into shared confidences, subtle flirtations, and moments of vulnerability. The public might see only smiles and handshakes, but behind the closed doors of Andrew's private life, interactions are charged with meaning, implication, and unspoken possibility. Private life for a royal is a paradox: freedom in confinement, control in constraint, intimacy under surveillance. Andrew, like many before him, understood the stakes. Every move could be misconstrued. Every interaction could become tomorrow's scandal. And yet, there was a human need to connect, to share, to experience. It was in these moments, away from cameras and public expectation, that Andrew claims his relationship with Meghan took shape. Not formally, not in public, but in a series of encounters that were as private as they were consequential. Andrew's narrative is filled with contradictions. He is a man judged harshly by history, yet he sees himself as someone whose truth has been misrepresented. He is publicly diminished, yet privately assertive. He is a figure of ridicule, yet he navigates his personal relationships with caution, calculation, and, at times, audacity. These contradictions make his story compelling, because they reveal a reality that no headline can capture: a royal human, deeply flawed, deeply emotional, and profoundly aware of the stakes of his every action. Now, consider the nature of secrecy in royal life. For Andrew, privacy was not merely a desire. It was a necessity. Every meeting, every conversation, every glance carried implications that could resonate far beyond the moment. Yet secrecy breeds intimacy. It creates spaces where boundaries can blur, where confessions can be shared, and where human impulses can surface without immediate consequence. According to Andrew, it was in these private spaces that he and Meghan developed a connection. A connection that, if revealed prematurely, could have caused irreparable damage to both their reputations. The intrigue intensifies when we examine the human element. Andrew, despite the scandals and losses, was still a man navigating emotions, desires, and human vulnerability. Meghan, despite the public image carefully crafted and curated, was also a participant in this private dynamic. A woman whose instincts, curiosity, and personality intersected with Andrew's in ways that were unrecorded, unverified, and unseen. What happens when two public figures collide in private, outside the gaze of cameras, security, and public expectation? According to Andrew, it leads to moments that are intimate, revealing, and explosive in potential consequences. The private life Andrew describes is not one of reckless abandon, but one of careful navigation. He recounts encounters where words, gestures, and subtle cues held immense weight. He speaks of discussions that teetered between casual and consequential, moments where the boundaries between public expectation and private desire were tested and sometimes crossed. The tension of these encounters lies not only in their secrecy, but in the awareness of potential exposure, a knowledge that every action could ripple through the palace and the world. And yet, even in the midst of secrecy, human flaws emerge. Andrew describes moments of misjudgment, moments where desire and curiosity may have overridden caution. The paradox of royal privacy is that even in isolation, one is never truly removed from the consequences of one's choices. Every action has a potential for revelation, every decision can become a headline, and every interaction carries the weight of history, tradition, and expectation. This is the crucible in which Andrew's revelations about Meghan Markle are forged, a crucible of secrecy, human desire, and high stakes. But here's the most compelling element. Andrew's story does not rely solely on shock or scandal. It is also a story of human contradiction, of the collision between public disgrace and private intimacy. It is a story that forces the audience to question assumptions, to explore the nuanced reality behind headlines, and to consider the complex interplay of secrecy, desire, and consequence. Andrew's private encounters with Meghan are not merely anecdotes. They are case studies in the tension between public image and private reality, between perception and truth. As we prepare to dive further into the specifics of Andrew and Meghan's interactions, one must ask, what drives a person to maintain secrecy despite the potential for public exposure? What compels someone to navigate complex, intimate relationships under the shadow of scandal? And most importantly, how do these private interactions inform the eventual public revelation that will shock the world? Andrew's private life, as he now recounts it, is the bridge between his fall from grace and the explosive claims that follow. And here's the cliffhanger. The encounters Andrew describes were not casual, nor were they merely coincidental. Something happened in these private moments, something intimate, surprising, and completely unexpected, that would not only leave Meghan speechless, but would also reverberate through the palace, media, and public consciousness. What came next would escalate the story in ways no one anticipated, and set the stage for revelations that could rewrite everything we thought we knew about both Andrew and Meghan. Have you ever wondered what happens when two people, each already living under the intense scrutiny of the world, cross paths in a way that no one expected, and how private interactions can explode into public scandal? That's exactly what happened when Meghan Markle entered Andrew's story. Up until this point, Andrew had been navigating his fall from grace, a life marked by public disgrace and private reflection. But everything changed when Meghan became a part of his narrative. A figure whose presence, charm, and influence would bring an entirely new layer of complexity to his life behind closed doors. The first thing to understand is that Meghan Markle was not simply a celebrity or a duchess. She was a global symbol of modernity, of controversy, of intrigue. She was the woman who had married into royalty in a way that defied centuries of expectation. Her public persona was carefully crafted, meticulously maintained, and fiercely protected. But like all public figures, she also had private dimensions, moments of vulnerability, curiosity, and desire that the world rarely glimpsed. According to Andrew, it was within these private spaces that the dynamic between them began to evolve. Andrew recalls their first encounters as almost ordinary on the surface. Polite exchanges, formal introductions, conversations that could have passed unnoticed in the bustling palace corridors. But beneath the surface, subtle tension and unspoken curiosity were building. For Meghan, meeting someone like Andrew, a prince both celebrated and infamous, was in itself an encounter fraught with fascination and intrigue. For Andrew, meeting Meghan was an encounter charged with the knowledge that she was not just another royal spouse or celebrity, but a woman whose presence could influence narratives, perceptions, and decisions on an international scale. What's fascinating about these early interactions is the duality. In public, they were nothing more than brief nods, smiles, and conversations. In private, according to Andrew, there was a nuanced dance, a delicate interplay of personality, curiosity, and restrained emotion. How does one navigate a private connection with someone who is simultaneously a global figure and a person with their own secrets, ambitions, and vulnerabilities? It's a question few outside the royal sphere could answer, yet Andrew was living it every day. Andrew claims that the private dimension of their relationship involved shared confidences, subtle flirtations, and exchanges that were never meant to leave those private rooms. There were moments of humor, moments of tension, and moments where both were acutely aware of the high stakes. Meghan, he says, was both intriguing and careful, never reckless, always aware of the potential consequences. Andrew himself was navigating a precarious balance between curiosity and caution, aware that any misstep could be amplified by the world outside. One of the most compelling elements of Andrew's account is the psychological interplay. Here are two people, both under intense public scrutiny, testing boundaries and gauging reactions. Meghan, known for her poise and carefully cultivated image, was engaging in behaviors and conversations that, if revealed, would shock her admirers and critics alike. Andrew, already a figure of scandal, was experiencing renewed curiosity, attraction, and even vulnerability, emotions complicated by the shadow of his own fall from grace. The private sphere created a space for exploration, reflection, and tension that the public could never witness. Andrew recalls instances where Meghan's behavior was calculated yet human. Moments that appeared casual in the context of the palace were loaded with meaning behind the scenes. A glance, a smile, an offhand comment. Each of these interactions carried weight. In the confines of private rooms, away from cameras and observers, human impulses collided with royal expectations, producing a cocktail of tension, intrigue, and curiosity. Andrew describes these encounters as charged not just with desire, but with the unspoken thrill of secrecy, the awareness that the world could never see these private moments. The story becomes even more provocative when considering the contrast between Meghan's public image and her private behavior. Publicly, she was a symbol of modernity, a woman who had married into tradition yet challenged conventions. Privately, according to Andrew, she was more complex, confident, assertive, curious, and, at times, provocative. The tension between her carefully managed public persona and her private interactions created a dynamic that Andrew found both fascinating and dangerous. How does one engage intimately with someone whose life is so intertwined with global scrutiny and public expectation? How do you balance desire, discretion, and the knowledge that exposure could be catastrophic? Andrew wrestled with these questions as he navigated the private corridors of the palace, where every word, gesture, and glance carried immense significance. Andrew also recalls moments of humor and humanity that are rarely seen in public accounts of Meghan. These were not the carefully staged smiles of cameras or the scripted appearances in official events. These were moments of genuine conversation, laughter, and connection, interactions that revealed a side of Meghan that the public almost never glimpses. And yet, intertwined with these human moments was a tension, a recognition that every interaction carried potential consequences. The stakes were higher than almost any private encounter could be for ordinary people, magnified exponentially by their public roles. The private interactions between Andrew and Meghan, he claims, eventually moved beyond mere conversation. They became charged with intimacy, subtle and restrained at first, building over time as trust, curiosity, and private connection deepened. These were not public moments. They were moments in which both parties understood the risks, the allure, and the consequences of their interactions. Andrew frames these encounters as entirely consensual, private, and meaningful in ways that no observer could anticipate. And yet, the tension between secrecy and revelation never fully dissipated. Both Andrew and Meghan were acutely aware that exposure could change everything: careers, reputations, public perception, and family dynamics. The paradox is clear. The more secretive and intimate these encounters were, the more explosive their revelation would become. And it is precisely this paradox that makes Andrew's eventual disclosure so compelling. He waited years, navigating disgrace, reflection, and public scrutiny, until the moment arrived when speaking out would not only reveal a hidden story, but would shock the world in ways that few could predict. Andrew's narrative also highlights the power dynamics inherent in these private encounters. He was a prince, stripped of certain privileges, but still carrying the weight of history, status, and influence. Meghan was a woman navigating her own complex path, asserting agency within the confines of royal expectation. The interplay of these dynamics created a relationship both fascinating and fraught with tension, a private connection that carried immense implications for both parties. And here's the cliffhanger that sets the stage for what comes next. According to Andrew, one private encounter, one charged moment behind closed doors, would define the rest of this story. It was a revelation so intimate, so unexpected, that it would not only leave Meghan speechless, but also set off a chain reaction that the public, and the palace, could never have anticipated. What happened in that moment? And how would it ripple through their lives, the royal family, and the world at large? What if a single private encounter could shatter public perception and force the world to question everything it thought it knew about two of the most scrutinized figures in the royal family? That's precisely what Andrew claims happened, and the details he shares are as shocking as they are intimate. For years, the public has speculated, assumed, and even condemned without knowing the private realities behind palace walls. But according to Andrew, what occurred in these moments goes far beyond rumor. It reveals a side of Meghan Markle no one has seen, and a side of Andrew that most assumed had been entirely silenced. Andrew begins by describing the atmosphere that led up to the encounter. It wasn't flashy. There were no cameras, no fanfare, no public gaze. It was a quiet, private room, removed from the eyes of the press and the scrutiny of royal protocol. But in this absence of spectators, a tension crackled. The kind of tension that exists when two people, fully aware of their public personas and reputations, meet behind closed doors. There's curiosity, there's caution, and there's a tacit understanding that everything in that room carries consequences far beyond the moment. The first moments, Andrew claims, were almost innocuous. Polite conversation, casual gestures, laughter breaking through the underlying tension. But even in those early exchanges, there was an unmistakable energy. A push and pull of personalities, a negotiation of boundaries, a subtle dance between restraint and desire. Andrew emphasizes that it was this private energy, this unobserved tension, that set the stage for what followed. What makes this encounter so compelling is the combination of secrecy and human instinct. Andrew was a man aware of the consequences, living in disgrace, yet encountering a woman whose presence commanded attention, curiosity, and reaction. Meghan, he claims, was equally aware, measured yet subtly provocative, navigating a careful line between private behavior and the awareness that exposure would be catastrophic. It's a dynamic that few outside the palace could truly understand. A private world governed by unspoken rules, uncharted desires, and an ever-present awareness of risk. Andrew recounts the moment the tension shifted from polite conversation to intimacy. He says it was subtle at first. A touch, a look, a shared laugh that lingered a second too long. These small gestures, he emphasizes, were loaded with meaning, signaling mutual awareness and unspoken curiosity. There was no public display, no casual acknowledgement, just the charged silence and the mutual understanding that something private was unfolding. The intensity of the encounter, according to Andrew, escalated quickly. Conversations became more personal, revealing confidences that were never meant to be shared with anyone outside that room. Meghan, he claims, disclosed thoughts, fears, and desires that contradicted her carefully managed public persona. The woman the world knew, the poised, curated figure, was in these moments a fully human being, vulnerable, curious, and engaged in a way that few had ever seen. Andrew, for his part, was navigating this revelation, balancing attraction with caution, awareness with desire. What makes this encounter extraordinary, Andrew asserts, is the depth of awareness on both sides. Every gesture, every word, every pause was measured. Both were acutely aware of the stakes, the potential fallout, and the impossibility of this interaction ever becoming public. And yet, the encounter continued, fueled by secrecy and the rare freedom of being unobserved. Andrew emphasizes that this is where the story diverges sharply from public speculation. The private intensity, the human emotion, the complexity of interaction is something the world has never been able to see or understand. Andrew's account also reveals moments of contradiction. He describes a woman who was both cautious and daring, playful and serious, aware of consequence, yet willing to explore the private dynamics unfolding between them. These contradictions, he says, made the encounter compelling, confusing, and ultimately unforgettable. It wasn't merely an encounter of curiosity or temptation. It was a collision of human behavior under circumstances few outside the palace could imagine. There's also an element of emotional intensity. Andrew describes feelings he hadn't expected: surprise, admiration, curiosity, and, yes, desire. These emotions were heightened by the awareness of secrecy. After all, the allure of a private interaction grows exponentially when you know exposure could be catastrophic. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully chosen word carried amplified significance. And for Andrew, the intensity of these emotions, and the acknowledgement that Meghan was engaging fully in this private dynamic, was both shocking and unforgettable. Audience, consider this. How would you navigate a situation where a person of immense public scrutiny engages with you in a private, intimate, yet controlled interaction? How do you reconcile attraction with discretion, desire with consequence? Andrew's story is a case study in navigating these extremes, in understanding human behavior under pressure, and in managing private truth under the shadow of public expectation. The encounter, Andrew says, reached a point where words were no longer sufficient. Gestures and proximity communicated meaning, conveying curiosity, willingness, and human complexity in ways that language alone could not. For the first time, Andrew claims, the private dimensions of their interactions became undeniable. Not in public, not in rumor, but in reality. This is the revelation that has been hidden behind palace walls, shielded from public view, and now finally coming to light. It is here, in the thick of this private encounter, that Andrew makes his most shocking claim. According to him, Meghan was involved with him intimately in private. The words are startling, the implications immense, and the public, if this were to be verified, would be forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew. Andrew presents this not as a boast, nor as a provocation, but as a statement of fact, a truth emerging from years of secrecy, isolation, and reflection. And yet, even in revealing this, Andrew frames the encounter with nuance. He emphasizes mutual consent, awareness, and the extraordinary context of privacy and discretion. There was no public scandal at the moment, no media frenzy, no immediate consequence. Just a private reality that now, years later, threatens to reverberate across palace corridors, tabloids, and social media feeds alike. The tension, of course, does not end here. Andrew's disclosure is only the beginning. The very fact that he has revealed this interaction sets off a cascade of questions. How will Meghan respond? What will the palace do? What is the public perception once this truth is fully digested? And what are the broader implications for the royal family, for Andrew's remaining legacy, and for Meghan's carefully curated image? Each of these questions compounds the drama, the intrigue, and the anticipation for what comes next. And here is the cliffhanger. According to Andrew, Meghan's reaction to his revelation was immediate, visceral, and completely unexpected. She did not simply respond with words. Her reaction, he claims, spoke volumes, leaving him, and anyone who might later hear about it, stunned. But what came next would ignite a firestorm that neither Andrew nor Meghan could have predicted, changing the trajectory of their story and setting the stage for public scrutiny, palace intervention, and scandal that the world had never anticipated. Imagine standing in a room, hearing a claim that challenges everything you thought about your own actions, your own life, and your carefully curated public image. That was Meghan Markle's reality, according to Prince Andrew, the moment he revealed the intimate details of their private encounters. Her reaction, he claims, was immediate, profound, and almost impossible to read. Silence, they say, can speak louder than words, and in this instance, Meghan's silence was louder than any headline could ever be. Andrew recalls the moment vividly. He says that after disclosing the private nature of their interactions, Meghan froze. Her initial facial expression was one of shock, a rare crack in the armor of the confident, poised public figure the world had come to know. Her eyes widened, a subtle tremor passed across her jawline, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Andrew notes that in that silence, every unspoken emotion was on display: disbelief, confusion, perhaps even guilt, or the recognition of the exposure of a secret she had meticulously managed. This silence was not merely a pause. It was a reaction loaded with meaning. Meghan's restraint was almost theatrical, controlled, deliberate, yet unable to completely mask the human response to an unexpected revelation. Andrew interprets this as a moment of unfiltered reality breaking through a lifetime of cultivated image. It was a moment that, if witnessed by anyone outside that private sphere, would have gone viral within minutes, consumed by public fascination and speculation. Think about it. How often do public figures experience moments like this, where their private realities clash so sharply with their public personas? Meghan Markle, accustomed to managing her image, to crafting every statement, every gesture, every smile, suddenly found herself confronted with a narrative she could neither control nor immediately deny. Andrew's revelation forced a confrontation with her own choices, with her past discretion, and with the potential implications for her public reputation. Andrew describes how the silence stretched, thickening the air in the room. There were no immediate words, no defensiveness, no denial, just the unspoken processing of a truth revealed. According to him, every passing second intensified the tension, as if the weight of the moment was pressing down on both of them. It was in this silence that Andrew realized the full gravity of what he had disclosed, and how unprepared Meghan was for this confrontation, despite the private nature of the conversation. Her reaction, Andrew claims, was layered. On one level, there was surprise, perhaps even shock at the revelation itself. On another, there was awareness, the recognition that this moment could never be unseen, that it carried implications beyond the walls of that room. Finally, there was restraint. A conscious effort to manage the fallout, to maintain composure, to navigate a scenario that could unravel public perception with one poorly chosen word or expression. The interplay of these emotions is fascinating because it highlights a contradiction in Meghan's persona. Publicly, she has always projected confidence, assertiveness, and control. Privately, according to Andrew, she was human, vulnerable, reactive, and caught off guard by a revelation she had not anticipated. It was a reminder that no amount of public composure can fully suppress the human response to unexpected truth, especially in the context of intimate interactions with someone whose life is intertwined with the very institution she had joined. Andrew also emphasizes the subtle cues he noticed during her silence. The way her hands shifted slightly, the tightening of her posture, the micro-expressions that flashed across her face. All of these nonverbal signals, he claims, communicated a mix of disbelief, concern, and contemplation. It was a moment of raw honesty, stripped of media training, public expectation, and image control. In that silence, Andrew says, he could almost read her thoughts, as if the private truth they shared had temporarily suspended the carefully constructed personas each had maintained in public. Audience, consider this. When someone reacts with silence rather than words, what does it really mean? Is it shock, guilt, strategy, or all of the above? Meghan's silence, Andrew asserts, was a complex emotional cocktail, revealing far more than any words could have conveyed. And yet, even in that pause, there was an underlying current of calculation, a recognition that this revelation, while private at the moment, had the potential to explode if it ever became public. Andrew also notes that the silence itself was transformative. It shifted the dynamic between them, changing not only the immediate emotional context, but also the potential trajectory of their interactions going forward. Silence can be a tool, a weapon, or a shield. In this case, it was all three. It protected Meghan in the moment, it conveyed her shock without words, and it simultaneously amplified the intensity of the encounter. Yet there is irony in this silence. Meghan, who has navigated global media scrutiny, royal expectations, and relentless public attention, found herself unprepared in a private room for a revelation that, while intimate, was also deeply personal. Andrew portrays this irony as emblematic of the broader tension between public persona and private reality, a theme that runs through the entirety of their interactions. In private, human responses surface, unfiltered, revealing truths that no public statement or curated image can hide. The question now becomes, what does one do in a moment like this? How does a person manage the shock of intimate exposure, particularly when that exposure involves someone already entangled in public scandal? Andrew claims that Meghan's silence was both a defensive mechanism and a genuine reflection of processing, a complex reaction to a situation that few could fully comprehend. And while the room may have been quiet, the implications of that silence were deafening. Andrew's account underscores that this reaction was only the beginning. Meghan's silence, while immediate and visceral, did not resolve the tension, it escalated it. It created a moment pregnant with anticipation, questions, and potential fallout. Andrew himself was struck by the weight of the reaction, recognizing that the narrative they were living in private was now poised to have public consequences, consequences that neither of them could have entirely predicted. And here's the cliffhanger. Meghan's silence, far from being a simple pause, masked a deeper reaction, one that Andrew claims was both strategic and emotional. What she did next, behind the closed doors, would not only confirm the intensity of the private encounter, but also set off a chain of events that would ripple through the palace, the media, and the world at large. What came next would escalate the story to a level nobody could have anticipated. And it would leave Andrew, Meghan, and the royal family grappling with consequences that were inevitable yet explosive. What happens when a secret, long buried behind palace walls, suddenly surfaces in a way that shakes the very foundations of the monarchy? That is exactly what unfolded when Andrew revealed the intimate details of his private encounters with Meghan Markle. The palace, which has long functioned as a fortress of protocol, discretion, and image control, suddenly found itself in uncharted territory. A storm of secrecy, scandal, and potential public backlash swirling faster than anyone could manage. The moment Andrew spoke, the palace entered a state of quiet panic. The corridors, usually echoing only with ceremonial footsteps, became charged with tension. Advisors, aides, and senior staffers scrambled to assess the damage, strategize, and predict the fallout. In private meetings, hushed voices debated what could be said, what must be contained, and how the story might leak to the press. Every detail mattered. A slip, a misstatement, a premature leak could ignite a global firestorm. Imagine the palace as a machine, meticulously designed to project order and control. And now, a hidden spark threatens to ignite chaos within its gears. Andrew's revelations were not just embarrassing, they were unprecedented. Royals rarely disclose private, intimate interactions, particularly those involving another high-profile member of the family. Meghan's silence, combined with the potential for public interpretation, amplified the stakes exponentially. The palace was not just managing a rumor. It was confronting a truth with the power to destabilize decades of carefully managed image and protocol. King Charles, already navigating a kingdom fraught with scrutiny, legal challenges, and media narratives, was reportedly furious. For a monarch, reputation is power, and power relies on perception. Andrew's disclosures, particularly given Meghan Markle's global fame and polarizing public image, threatened not only to embarrass individual family members, but to challenge the authority of the crown itself. According to sources, Charles convened emergency meetings with senior advisors, legal counsel, and communications teams, all focused on one goal: containment. But containment was easier said than done. Unlike a minor scandal or misstatement, Andrew's revelations were deeply personal, intimate, and explosive. They implicated not just him, but Meghan Markle and, by extension, the entire royal institution. Staffers struggled to parse the layers of truth, speculation, and media interest, understanding that any misstep could be amplified by journalists, social media, and global audiences hungry for scandal. Every strategy needed precision, speed, and foresight, but none of them could anticipate the public's reaction once this truth began to leak. At the heart of the palace turmoil was a fundamental contradiction: privacy versus public perception. Andrew's disclosures were private, intended for controlled understanding, yet the content itself had the power to ripple outward uncontrollably. Meghan's silence complicated the matter further. Without a response, speculation would fill the void, and the media narrative would be dictated by imagination, rumor, and partial truths. Palace officials knew that controlling perception required both speed and subtlety, yet Andrew's revelations had already shifted the dynamic in unpredictable ways. The staff and advisors faced a delicate balancing act. How much to intervene? How much to suppress? How much to guide public understanding? There were legal considerations, media strategies, and reputation management protocols to weigh. But beyond the logistics was a more profound concern: the emotional and psychological impact on the family. The royal family is both institution and family, bound by duty, loyalty, and public expectation. Yet private conflicts, tensions, and secrets have always existed, and now one of the most explosive had surfaced, challenging both the institution and its emotional core. Andrew's disclosures also prompted immediate reassessment of security protocols. Private conversations, previously considered safe behind palace doors, were suddenly viewed with suspicion. Staffers wondered who might be aware, who might have overheard, and how the information could potentially leak to the press. Every person connected to Andrew and Meghan became a potential source of revelation, intentional or accidental. The palace's traditional methods of secrecy were suddenly under threat, and the machinery of royal discretion groaned under the pressure. Meanwhile, advisors grappled with predicting Meghan's next move. Publicly, she had been silent. Privately, the palace had little insight into her strategy. Was she preparing a response? Was she considering legal action, public clarification, or a private confrontation? Andrew's revelation placed Meghan in a reactive position, forcing her to navigate both the private emotional impact and the potential public consequences of disclosure. The palace, for its part, watched anxiously, aware that her response, or lack thereof, could define the narrative for months, perhaps years, to come. The human element cannot be ignored. Royals, despite their public image, are still people, susceptible to emotion, misjudgment, and impulse. Andrew's disclosure introduced layers of emotional intensity into a highly controlled environment. Trust was tested, loyalties questioned, and alliances reevaluated. Even staff who had served loyally for decades found themselves uncertain, wondering how a private encounter could provoke such sweeping disruption. The palace, usually a symbol of order, suddenly felt precarious, as if a delicate sculpture had been struck and was wobbling dangerously. Andrew himself, observing the palace's reaction, realized the magnitude of what he had unleashed. Silence in the room was no longer just Meghan's. It was the palace's, the staff's, and even his own as he processed the potential consequences. He watched as senior officials debated, whispered, and strategized, all while the world outside remained unaware of the storm that was quietly forming behind locked doors. And there is irony in all this. The palace, historically a fortress of discretion and control, was suddenly navigating uncharted territory, a disclosure that was intimate, personal, and explosive, yet entirely private. The very mechanisms designed to protect the monarchy, the advisors, the legal teams, the communications staff, were now reacting to a truth that had escaped anticipation. Andrew's revelation had shifted power dynamics, recalibrated relationships, and forced everyone involved to confront a reality they could neither ignore nor entirely control. So what happens next in a palace consumed by secrecy, shock, and strategy? Andrew's disclosure had set the stage for action, reaction, and counteraction. Every individual had a role, every decision mattered, and every second carried potential consequences. And yet, the most intense moments were still ahead. According to Andrew, the encounter that had sparked this turmoil was only the beginning. The private revelations that would follow would escalate the tension, intensify scrutiny, and forever alter the narrative surrounding both him and Meghan Markle. And here is the cliffhanger. Just as the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, Andrew claims that a follow-up revelation occurred, one so unexpected that it caused confusion, fear, and disbelief even among the most seasoned advisors. What happened next would not just shock the palace. It would send ripples across the royal family and the world, altering the story in ways nobody anticipated. What happens when one secret triggers another, and suddenly the palace is not just dealing with a scandal, it's grappling with a cascade of revelations that collide in ways nobody could anticipate. That is exactly what happened after Andrew's disclosure about Meghan Markle. The intimate private encounter, once thought safely contained, became the catalyst for a series of events that intertwined past scandals, hidden loyalties, and unspoken rivalries within the royal family. The first ripple came immediately. The palace, already in turmoil from Andrew's revelation, began to uncover links between this disclosure and prior rumors, previous interactions, and historical tensions that had never been fully resolved. Staffers whispered about old controversies, advisors reviewed prior correspondence, and even minor incidents that had been buried were suddenly re-examined under a new lens. What once might have seemed insignificant, passing remarks, private dinners, hushed conversations, now took on extraordinary weight. Every detail mattered. Andrew's disclosure did more than shock Meghan. It reignited conversations about past events that the royal family had struggled to keep contained. The intersection of scandals created a complex web that entangled not just Andrew and Meghan, but others in the family who had been indirectly involved or whose reputations were connected by proximity. King Charles, Princess Anne, and even distant cousins became part of a narrative that threatened to unravel decades of careful management and public relations control. The palace had to operate with precision, understanding that any misstep could magnify the already volatile situation. Consider the emotional climate within the palace. For centuries, royals have relied on discretion, hierarchy, and tradition to maintain order. Yet Andrew's revelation introduced a dynamic that disrupted all of that. It was personal. It was intimate. It was explosive. And unlike previous scandals that could be managed through controlled statements or private negotiations, this one touched directly on private behavior, human desires, and the complex psychology of relationships. This wasn't just a PR problem. It was a human problem, magnified by history, protocol, and public scrutiny. The collision of scandals became evident in meetings convened by senior officials. Advisors debated endlessly, weighing Andrew's credibility against Meghan's reputation, analyzing what the public might believe, and calculating how the story could be contained or mitigated. Legal teams reviewed past agreements, communications, and precedents, searching for leverage to protect the monarchy. Meanwhile, PR strategists worked furiously to anticipate leaks, social media reactions, and media narratives. Every office, every corridor, every phone line buzzed with urgency, tension, and fear of exposure. Adding fuel to the fire was the public's appetite for scandal. Andrew's revelations, though private, quickly became a topic of intense speculation. Even before the details could be officially confirmed or denied, whispers began to circulate among journalists, royal watchers, and social media influencers. The collision of old rumors